So let's give it a start. I'm very happy to host you online today for this first webinar of our winter season here at IFEAC in Bishkek. Let me introduce first our special guest, Anton Ikhsanov, who's an Orientalist historian from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Anton also participated to the activities and network of the Erasmus Plus strategic partnership called Eurasian Insights, of which IFEAC is a core member. This is actually how we met initially, Anton and I. I will give him the floor for a presentation entitled Eastern Correspondence of Alexander Samoilovich, a study of networks of intercultural communications in Eurasia. And then, after his presentation, this will be followed by comments from Xavier Hallez, who's a senior researcher here at IFEAC. And this will also open finally the floor for the Q&A session. So Anton, the floor is yours. Very happy to host you, and please, yeah, we listen to you.
Okay, thank you, Adrien. Well, I will start with the presentation. A bit. Second. So let's get started. Today, I will speak about an Oriental correspondence of Alexander Samoilovich, so-called Oriental correspondence. It's actually a very interesting topic that I was working with for a long time, and it is about a very spread and separate corpus of letters from his informants or assistants from the Turkish-speaking group inhabiting the territory of the former Russian Empire and the former Ottoman Empire. So the correspondence these days is actually a very important topic within the intellectual history because it represents a specific way of knowledge exchange, the so-called commerce of knowledge. We will take a look at theoretical approaches that is used nowadays for the study of that kind of source. It is actually closely related with the roles of the go-betweens in the intellectual history, because the knowledge from different, rather distant sides of the world were transmitted directly to the centers where the academic communities were working with them. And knowledge is actually useless unless communicated. It means that knowledge is socially productive. And without the social networking and without that kind of environment and that conditions, it is not working. So we had this kind of necessity to study the actual network theory and to study those communities that were involved in this exchange, to take a look at the knowledge itself and its nature and its that kind of the process of its construction. So the economy of correspondence is actually rather fragile because it required a lot of investment both in trustworthy channel of communication, which is closely connected with the issue of privacy, because the privacy is the main element of the correspondence, and politeness, because politeness and ethics is actually the most important thing for the further growing and increasing of the network and boosting that kind of exchange. The correspondence has two sides. First, it's actually knowledge exchange, and the second is actual cognition of the other, which is closely connected with the cognition of the self. So I propose to adhere to very important things. First of all, it's the multiple layerness of this and the multiple dimension of this interaction. And the second is the agency of the actors involved in this network of communicators. So there are two crucial questions. The first one was formulated by Fauve during his study of Samoilovich's diaries. It was knowledge acute to a state of empathy and an antidote to estrangement? And the second is my own. Is it possible to speak about the knowledge from the perspective of one voice, Samoilovich's voice as an Orientalist, or it is a multiplicity of the voices? So I will continue with a brief discussion of the context of this interaction that I will mention. The age of the 19th and 20th century was a period of severe crisis and the crisis of armchair philology, because it reached its limitation of its methodology, and there happened that kind of surge, the seeking for alternative versions of methodology. Though Samoilovich, as the Russian Orientalist and one of the prominent philologists, was involved in this process, he had tried to find his own specific way to approach this knowledge. And the second is the seeking of the new methodologies from the side of the Muslim intellectuals who find their communities in crisis and who wanted to make some kind of transit from one type, one mode of reading of the text to another. And it's interesting because if we will look at works written by, for example, Alfred Bustano, we'll find out that the Muslim intellectuals had numerous options, numerous alternatives to address to. For example, they were able to go to the Near East, or they were or to develop their own methodology. The last but not the least was the modernist concepts in the making. The modernist concepts were used and were appropriated by the Muslim intellectuals and both by Orientalists, and they were in communication for the further inclusion and introduction of those modernist concepts on the ground. I will speak about the concept of nation and the concept of state. And all that crisis happened that kind of foregoing and approaching crisis from the 1905 and sequence of revolutions. The first Russian Revolution, then the February Revolution, the situation with the rebellion in the Central Asia, and after that, the Civil War and the political transformation of the region and the former Russian Empire. So I was working in the 4 archives here in St. Petersburg, in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg branch of the Archive of Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts, and then the home archive of Samoilovich's. I was granted an access here to this part of the text by Marin Platonov Samoilovich, the granddaughter of Alexander Nikolaevich. So I was able to find 38 letters and 6 dedication inscriptions in the books were transmitted here to St. Petersburg to Samoilovich by his informants. Mostly all of the scripts were written in Turkic languages, but some inclusions of in quotes in Arabic and Persian. So that's are the examples of the letters and materials that I was working with. Of course, they were studied before by some of the prominent scholars. I should mention 2 very important works by Dr. Muhammad Aliyev from Turkmenistan, who analyzed the relation between Samoilovich and one of his prominent informants, Hojali Mullah Murat Berdioglu. And he mentioned a very important thing, that Hojali Mullah was actually directed in his actions by his own aesthetic taste, which means that Hojali Mullah was already in the process of limitation of Samoilovich's perception of the Turkmen cultural phenomena. And the second work was written by Michael Kemper and is dedicated to the relation between Samoilovich and Rizaeddin Fakhriddinov, one of the prominent mufti of this period. And Michael Kemper mentioned in his work that, and it should be noted, that the question of trust was an essential and the most important within this kind of correspondence. The latest work was written in this year by Tatiana Kutyukova and Ilya Zaitsev, and it is dedicated to Samoilovich's relation with Ismail Gasparinsky, one of the leading Jadid of the Russian Empire. But I think that this work, the latest work, is rather doubtful. And we can see the difference in translation that was presented in the work with my translation. And the main difference from my perspective is the key idea, because they concentrated on the question of the nationalism and different forms of nationalism within the Russian Empire. The nationalism of Gasparinsky from one side, and the nationalism by Menshikov, the Russian nationalist, from another point. And I think it is that this letter that you can see on the screen is actually dedicated to the way of further political transformation of the world, because they were discussing the situation on the Balkans in the Ottoman Empire. And Kaspersky mentioned that this is a time for the nations to come to the area, and the empires should unify those nations. So it is a very interesting point, and this letter is actually a very interesting source of information about the communication between two rather prominent figures in the cultural space of the Russian Empire. So I will address three important issues within the topic on correspondence. The first is channel of communication. The second is trust, and the third is motivation. So the channels of communication, there were two different channels of communication. The first one, of official one, through the post service of the Russian Empire and the foreign states, because Samoilovich was actually in the correspondence with the Ottoman officers. And the second one is unofficial, through the personal relationship. And the second was prioritized because it provides a huge investment in the privacy. It requires a huge investment in the privacy, and the privacy was the main issue for the communication. So that kind of investment in the formation of this channel provide a formulation of the line of mediators who transfer the message from one to another. And we can see those lines of mediators that are truly very big chain, including numerous personalities. For example, if Khojaly Mullah wanted to send his message to Samoilovich to St. Petersburg, he was obliged to give it to the eye doctor in Mer City, Ipanatiev, who sent it to the Russians who were directing to St. Petersburg, like Darlington, and then Samoilovich received it. And sometimes Samoilovich was not an ultimate addressee. That in St. Petersburg there were living numerous Turkmens, and some of them are presenting on this slide. Among them, Makhtum Kulikhan. It was the Turkmen representative in the State Duma in the Russian parliament. Nikolai Yumutsky, the Russian officer of the Turkmen origin, was actually a very important colonial administrator, and Kokajan Birdiyev, the first ever Turkmen student at the Petrograd University. There was also Ahmed Bek, the first ever Turkmen who lived in St. Petersburg, but I wasn't able to find his photo. So in some cases, there was an intersection between this network with well-established previous networks. And Yumutsky and Berdiyev are the prominent examples here, illustrious examples here, because, for example, Yumutsky had his own network within the Muslim societies in the capitals and in Trans-Caspian region, and Berdiyev was able to reach Samoilovich with his letter even during the Samoilovich's expedition to Stavropol, through the relation between the Turkmens of Trans-Caspian region, Astrakhan region, and Stavropol region. And it shows such a great amount of developed networks inside this territory, even before the Samoilovich began to formulate his own network. And sometimes it happened, the interference that the participants, the mediators, were able to interfere into the chain of the mediators. There is a prominent example about, Bryce example about Said Kamal, who was obliged to send Samoilovich, to deliver to Samoilovich 5 books, and he took one of them for his own purpose because he liked it. So Samoilovich, only 4 books received Samoilovich in St. Petersburg, while one stays was retained by Said Kemal. Well, about the personal trust, and it is important to mention the work written by Michael Kemper about the resides in Fakhretdinov, because before the beginning of the Stalin's purges, it was Fakhretdinov who sent Samoilovich almost his entire library. And he mentioned in his note that due to the personal trust of Samoilovich, he can explain all the details of the destiny of his library. Even those details were actually a crime, because at this period to sell, an attempt to sell the books to the foreigners, especially those of the Muslim Islamic books to the foreigners, was actually a crime. And he had no fear to describe this situation to Samoilovich, it wasn't impossible, but it was impossible to do that in an open public space. So I want to start with the description how the communication was established and ordinary was established. Samoilovich described in his reports that he met a lot of men of books in the Muslim society. He called it люди книжные. And they began their discussions over the books over Islam and some of the main points of the Islamic religion and literature. We had numerous examples of such discussion. And sometimes they were discussed the political issues, like it happened with the Turkish and Ottoman officers. Then their position were transferred in symbolic capital. They became those intermediaries who were able to send messages, to exchange books, and who were able to publish their results and to address the political issues. And this position of Samoilovich and his informant was also a point for interest for the other members of the communities who wanted to join this network. For example, there is a note written by the Tatar writer Fatih Amir Khan, who wanted to join, who wanted to meet Samoilovich when he was in Kazan. So another point of interest for these communities was a common comprehension of modernist concepts. For example, they insisted on the language as a key marker of their identity. And the informant has to adapt to Samoilovich's way of thinking and Samoilovich's way of speaking. Because for Samoilovich, the first language was the Ottoman Turkish, and he wasn't able to communicate in much more in Uzbek or in Tatar language. So, for example, Chulpon, the prominent Uzbek writer and poet, introduced some Turkish notions and some Turkish phrases in his letters. And Hoca Limulat tried to establish the communication in the most traditional way. He, for example, used a lot of greetings in Arabic language. And those his letters are huge with that kind of the high style. But from my perspective, what is the most important, Hoca Ali Mullah and Sabur Mullah were mostly exceptions, because the majority of the personalities that formed the network were actually the representatives of the new generation of the Muslim intellectuals. And they were educated in the imperial schools, and they were able to communicate with Samoilovich, and they were able to understand his comprehension of the modernist concepts. And there is a photo, for example, taken in Yessentuki during the rest of Samoilovich's family with Abdurrahim Akhverdov, the prominent Azerbaijani writer. And on the back of this photo, there is this kind of line: I wish our union stay unbreakable. And the personal relation and the kind of the personal trust was even more intensified within the family structures. And we can see that Humulsky's family was closely connected to Samoilovich. Even after the death of Humulsky, his children, they are represented on third photo, were educated in Samoilovich's Leningrad Turkological Institute. And they were educated under his guidance. But there were, of course, some controversies. And one of the most controversial cases is the relation between Samoilovich and Ahmed Zeki Validi Tagan. Well, Validov is well-known Tatar and Bashkir intellectual, and he was a huge critique of Orientalism as a system of thought. And Samoilovich was a representative as all the saints of Orientalism itself. So Validov blamed Orientalists in overgeneralization, the lack of thoughtfulness, and superficial approach. However, he was in a very good relation with Samoilovich's academic advisor, Vasily Bartel, and they had something in common. First of all, it was the status of language, the interest in methodology, and the critique of French and Hungarian Orientalists. And also, a very important thing, it was an inclusion of the Tatar history into the textbooks of the empire, alongside and with full right with the history of Russians. So, and the question about French Orientalism is actually relied on the works by Renoir and the possibility of communication between Islam and the progress. So Ahmed Zeki Validi Tagan mentioned in his article in the Shura newspaper that Orientalists are not familiar with our language, our meanings, and our traditions, and that's the key fault of his critique towards the Orientalism itself. So we see that kind of different relations between different informants and different actors. And the final part of my presentation will be dedicated to the motivation of communication. And was it so, one-side oriented? Of course, it was not. It was the literal exchange. And we should speak about the motivation of both sides. For Orientalists, the communication was first of all a vital resource for their activity. They wanted to have an access to the inner mechanism of the text circulation, because before that period, numerous Orientalists were limited with their efforts to understand local culture by the book bazaar in Bukhara, and they wanted to communicate directly to the living representatives of these communities. But Samoilovich very quickly found out that there are two languages of communication, especially within the Turkmen society. The first language was for inner communication, as he described it, and the second was for the communication with the outsiders. And the trouble was that he could not break the wall between these two languages, as he wrote in his article. And Orientalists actually were in rivalry between each other for the gain of control over that resource, the communicational resource. And there was a rivalry between Samoilovich and his classmate, Ivan Belayev, who's represented on the photo. Ivan Belayev was a colonial administrator, and he was working on the study of the local schools. He was an inspector of the local educational system. And he wanted to fight against the Samoilovich's monopoly on the formulation of knowledge about the Turkmens. So he established the Turk-Caspian newspaper for the indigenous population. And we can easily find that since the foundation of this newspaper in the 1914, we see the decrease of the publications written by former Samoilovich's informants and the decrease of Samoilovich's interest in the Turkmenistan. And we see on the second photo that he is one of the Samoilovich's informants, Sabur Mullah, and his wife, his youngest wife. So, and another point of interest within the Samoilovich and within Samoilovich's intention was the mission of Orientalism. The Orientalists themselves see where, they considered their community as an important group for the further development of the local societies. They wanted to implement the European theory on the local with a combination of the local knowledge. So they wanted to have this kind of communication to make a transfer between the European intellectual legacy and the local intellectual legacy. And they wanted the inclusion of different Turkish-speaking groups within the body empire. So, and they say and they were able to see that kind of feedback from local societies, and I will discuss it later. But what was the intentions from the side of the informants? Well, it is a very interesting quote by Xavier Mullah, who actually described it all. I wrote these words due to my unemployment. So informants actually were not such subaltern in the full meaning of this word. They had their own agency, and they wanted to realize their own ideas, and they entered these communication networks for a reason, and all of them had their own reasons for doing that. For example, there's an option of searching a new way to read text, in particular in Arabic. There are some interesting examples described by Samoilovich in his diary, for example, where he mentioned Baka Hoja, a student of Samarkand Madrasa, who was working with the Girgis dictionary on Arabic language of Quran Karim. Another example was connected with Mortazian, a local teacher, and I will show you later the quote that is connected with this case. Another example was an attempt to escape the controversial academic environment during the Soviet period. And it was related with the names of Abdullah Khan Alavi and Gozi Olim Yunusov, were the prominent writers and the prominent scholars in Uzbekistan. They mentioned in their letters that there is a huge pressure by the high authorities of the Academy of Sciences authorities of the Uzbek academia, and they wanted to go further. They wanted to go to Leningrad and go to Europe to continue their work. And in that sense, we should also speak that the informants assessed that kind of possibility to limit the European perception of their own communities, the limitation of Orientalist perception, due to the two very important toolkits. The first one is silence, and the second is selectiveness. So we couldn't describe them as some kind of subaltern in the complete sense of this word. So there is an example about Murtazin, who asked to send him lectures of the Arabic language written by the professors from the Faculty for Oriental Languages, because they had a discussion how to facilitate the study of Arabic in the Volga region. And another example is about Chulpon. Initially, Chulpon seems to be a subaltern in his own right. He described his own political thoughts and his own political views and found himself under the pressure of the Soviet political regime, but later in the letter tried to avoid restriction and re-establish communication with the Turkey that was crashed in the 1926, because he wanted to have an access to the Turkish intellectual product. So it's not a subaltern who wanted, to change the rule of the game, and he knew quite well indeed that Samoilovich is actually head of the common academic council between Turkey and the USSR. So Samoilovich had access to the book exchange with the Turkey, and he can re-establish the communication between the Uzbek scholars and the Central Asian scholars and the Turkish scholars. So I will go to my conclusion that at the beginning of the 20th century, we can observe such kind of a very difficult situation and the crisisness of the Eurasian space, where all the groups, all the communities were seeking for the development and for alternative variation, for methodology, and most of all, for the formulation of the visions of the future. And by doing so, they created numerous networks of communication, and Samoilovich created his own network to exchange knowledge. However, Samoilovich and this network has a particular impact on the formulation of the knowledge about Central Asia. However, Samoilovich's work, in my view, was not his single voice. It was a multiplicity of voices affected by the knowledge exchange process and by these possibilities to limit his views and even to present the necessity, those things that they consider the most vital and the most important in their view. I mean, the informants. And finally, I would like to, to express my appreciation to my colleagues who helped me to work on this material from a very different cities. It's actually the network in his own right. And finally, I will mention two quotes. The first one was written to me by Walter Feldman, an Israeli and US specialist on Ottoman music, who was actually a student of Karl Menges, the prominent Dutch German Orientalist. When he found out that I was working on Samoilovich, he said, my tutor was educated by Samoilovich, and it's so interesting how in that way we're connected, because Karl Menges was later immigrated to Florida, and he was a tutor of the Turkish language in the University of Florida. And finally, the final quote is a quote from one of the letters written by Hojali Mullah. It is a quote in Arabic. A letter is actually half of a meeting. So thank you very much for your attention. And I appreciate your time and your ability to listen to my very bad English. So thank you.
Thank you, Anton. On the contrary, my English is even worse, so I'm ashamed. I will take benefit of this very short intervention as a moderator to greet and to say to our public that we are very happy that they are connected here. I see some people joined us just a few minutes after we formally started, and we all know that technicalities are an issue in these terrible times of COVID-19 and Zoom. So really thank you for everyone joining us on a Saturday, and I was very impressed by your presentation, and I'm happy now to give the floor to my colleague Xavier Hallez, who's a researcher here at IFEAC, for a couple of initial comments.
Hello, thank you, Anton, for your very interesting presentation. There was a lot of things inside it, a lot of questions, and it's part of the content and also all the element of conceptual and methodology were also very interesting in your presentation. Here you are talking about Oriental correspondence, and that's very interesting, of course, to see correspondence as a privileged relationship, which implies, as you say, the exchange and also exchange about knowledge of on each other, and in a way which is different from other relationship, that it's also a kind of personal links and private relations, which are very different from, of course, the official kind of relation and other different kind of relation that we can find in sources, in archives, especially. So your work is very interesting, and it's also time to remember also Irina Yerofeeva, who is our dear colleague, historian from Kazakhstan, who left us this week. And she also had a very bright look on correspondence. And one of this very huge work she did for long years was the correspondence of all the Khans and elites, Kazakh elites from the 18th and the 19th century. And here we see that this correspondence is very fruitful sources for the making of history and for the understanding of relations and of the positionment of a person in this kind of political history between Russia and Central Asia. So I think that your presentation in this sense is really very interesting and point out many elements who are, I think, really crucial in the understanding of this relationship, colonial, post-colonial, and the construction of thinking about the population, Central Asian population, and how we can build society, change society, and build also a comprehension about history, folklore, literature of Central Asia. So here you are talking about social networks. So one of the first questions I will have about this point is, so you are talking about different kind of individuals. So in first, of course, Alexander Samoilovich, and also a person who are from the Muslim, Russian Muslim world. So you, in your presentation, you talk mainly about intellectual scholars, elites, cultural elites, and here you don't really mention the term which is very often employed for this person, like intelligentsia, intelligent. So one of the questions is, what do you think about this element of the naming, when we name the person intelligentsia? What does it implies to use one or another name for this person? And also, what kind of limits are implemented by the choice of designation? So if you said intelligentsia, if you said elites, scholars, what does it mean, and how do you work with it? Another point that you made really important in your presentation is the books, and you make a kind of central element of intellectual relationship. So I think that's really very interesting to see. Of course, at that time, as you said, books were kind of rare. Of course, there is a lot of publication, but sometimes there was a lot of books who are very hard to get. And so it's very interesting to see the relation between this correspondence and with the sending of books, and after all the discussions that we could have around books. It remember also one of the important brochure with Oyan Kazakh, Awake Kazakhs from Miryakub Dulatov, and we also can see a lot of this kind of social network through the diffusion of these books from Bishkek, where he was at that time, to the Kazakh steppes and to Tatar, and where it was published. And also these kind of elements are very interesting. And also to see the book as a way to open many doors. I think especially for Samoilovich, that when he gave books to people in Central Asia, it was also a way to begin a kind of a relation and to be more able to have access to discussions and to the trust you were talking about. So to permit scientific discussion, and also it's a way to create a specific relationship when you give a book from hand to hand, or through, of course, through mediators, but it's a personal links that you made around scientific discussion or scientific debates. So after it opened to this discussion. So there's a lot of things to say. So I'm just trying to make different remarks and some questions. Also here, you are talking mainly about informants and also people who can give information to Samoilovich. So that's one of the way of this relation. And it goes mainly through the collect of folklores or literature. So as you know, that was a real general practice in the Russian Empire, and afterward also in the Soviet Union. So in a sense, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, why do you think it was so important? Of course, it nourish the national discourses, all this folklore, the history, the making of national history. And Samoilovich is one of the actors of this collecting of folklore, and he have his own way to make this collecting of folklore. And as you said it, is also for his personal career. He also was in kind of estimating himself as a very important person in Orientalism, and his discourses, he wanted that his discourse was listened to and was one of the main discourses on Orientalism. So maybe here what will be interesting also is to compare with other persons who were part of this process of collecting folklores, and were also part of other social networks. And especially I wanted to, because also he's older than Samoilovich, it's Grigory Potanin, who also was one of the main figure, maybe not with Turkmens or Uzbek, more on the north with Kazakhs and people from Siberia, but we were also a kind of specific social network with a lot of correspondence, letters and exchanges and informants. And maybe, I don't know if you have looking at him more specifically, or you have some idea of comparison in the way they were doing and creating and after nourishing their social networks. Then I will go to one of the ideas. I think it's very important. It's a question of trust. Here maybe I can say maybe that it's more trust than confidence. Here maybe there is different kind of elements which can be questions. One of who can be trusted in what way? So when you were building these networks, you were putting the different persons through who were going the letters or the sendings, and it's quite interesting to maybe to have an idea about how these networks were constructed, who were the person, they were from the same culture, from the same region, the same city, the same social environment, or they were family links, friends, or maybe other persons who were with no contacts, but that you can trust. Why do you can trust this person and not others? Especially when you say that during the Tsarist period or after the Soviet period, there were censorship, and there were also political police who were looking at this kind of latest correspondence. So how you can make, how can you trust a person? And this point of trust is also for me very, very interesting, and that you pointed it out. It's also, I'm very happy of it, because it's one of the elements I found when I was doing my PhD on 3 revolutionaries from the Orient, a Tatar, a Buryat, and the Kazakh. And one of the main problem national communists encounters with their relation, in their relation with the party members from Moscow, it was a problem of trust, because there was always people who didn't trust them. They were thinking that they were not real revolutionary. And this question of trust was one of the main problems. And even between national communists, the problem of trust was also one of the big issues. Now, next point also is that I think it's very, very important when you were talking about double language, the official and the public. And here it's just make me thinking about the works of James C. Scott, the American anthropologist, which is called The Domination and the Art of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts, and we are published in '92. And here he made this notion of transcripts, hidden and public, and which are established ways of behaving and speaking that fit particular actors and particular social settings, whether dominant or oppressed. And in our case, these transcripts are intertwined because they are often elaborate within the relationship between Russian and Central Asian scholars, intellectuals, or simply informants. And one of the questions also, if you found some differences between content and discourse in the letters and in publications by Samoilovich. Of course, another, yeah, maybe one of the last question after I will let you answer. That's the question of the person who are acting in these social networks of Samoilovich. You said that there was a lot of young people who were modernists, and here maybe there come some more elements about their personal interest and also their career, the way they were thinking, how they could integrate the Russian Empire or after the Soviet system through this kind of relation. So what do they wanted to have like concrete benefits from these social networks? So again, I very thank you for your presentation. You are very interesting, and there was a lot of very interesting points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier, for your questions. Wow, let's get started with the first one. Why I didn't use the word intelligentsia, mostly because, well, I think at the initial stage of the communication, it was the communication with the Muslim intellectuals as a common ground, as the kind of community, whole community which was connected with the regional and macro-regional and even trans-regional networks. And it's and they have no that kind of local affiliation. They were not formulating the specific group within the specific people. They were communicating each other on the different conditions, on quite distinguishable conditions. And I think that intelligentsia in the whole sense of this word became to formulating this interracial with institutionalization of the Soviet regime. And even for some communities, maybe before it, maybe during the imperial period, for example, in Kazakhstan, in the case of Alasharda, but at the initial stage, Samoilovich's relations were connected not with this particular group, but connected with those Muslim intellectuals such as Sabur Mullah, Hoja Ali Mullah, Bay Muhammad Mullah. So you say all of them were the religious figures. And if we'll speak about further development of this network, of course, later it was intelligentsia, but I'm not sure is it possible, to use it for the entire personalities included in that kind of network. So the second is about books and relation between correspondence and books. I think over 20 letters were dedicated to the book exchange. So out of, it's half of the entire list. And they were, primarily, it was a note included with the books. In the case of the book exchange, there was, for example, the case of Musa Begiyev, a prominent Tatar reformist, one of the leading Islamic scholars of the Russian Empire. And his letter to Samoilovich is actually a note that he put in his books, and he asked Samoilovich for the review of these books. So it is the direct communication, it is the direct connection, and it is a rather close tie between the books and the correspondence. And in some cases, it is about not only the collecting, it is about collecting books. In the case of Hoja Ali Mullah, who was, going all around the Turkmen steppes and collecting the materials for Samoilovich. In other cases, it is about asking for Samoilovich to send them books. Once again, Hoja Ali Mullah asked Samoilovich if he will publish, if there will be a publication of genealogy of Turkmens, Shajara Tarakima. He wanted to get this book to his possession. So he asked Samoilovich to send him this book from St. Petersburg. So it was, there were, I think, rather integrated process of the book exchange and the correspondence exchange. About the collecting of folklore, well, it is rather hard questions because initially Samoilovich was sent to Transcaspian region for that purpose, to collect the folklore of Turkmens, but he had his own position that Turkmens had no folklore. He mentioned this in some early publications that all of the verses he was able to collect were associated with this or that writer. Later on, he found out that some of these figures are mythological, or sometimes the name is associated only with a specific region or to the desire of the teller. But initially, he thought that there is no folklore among the Turkmens, and he was looking at this as some kind of an element of the progress. So later on, he was actually very severely involved in that. And his works on, for example, Yakut folklore are crucial for the understanding of the process inside these societies. So for them, for the Orientalist community, at the beginning, I think the title of the main journal, Живая старина, the living, antiquity, the preserved antiquity, is actually demonstrate their intention to the folklore. They tried to collect it. They thought that it would, vanish in front of modernism and modernization and the Russian imperial oppression and that kind of coloniality that will, erase all the folklore out. And later on, during the Soviet period, they began to transform this idea, and they introduced the idea that folklore could actually be a source for words for linguist reform. And I know that you had a publication about the Kazakh dictionaries. So you should be familiar with, you know, that kind of topic. And they use it for folklore to enlarge the words and the dictionaries. And it was Samoilovich who was one of the authors of the project of Turkmen Academic Dictionary, where he proposed the idea to collect the folklore monuments and later on to take the words out of them and to systemize them. But there was actually rather, from my point of view, different viewing of the future of these monuments and the future of dictionaries. And I was working on the article about it. I hope to continue this work because in some cases they thought that there would be, you know, an essential evolution. So the communities will change themselves, and the only role of Orientalists is to see what changes will be going in the future. So about the comparison of Samoilovich with other collectors, I was working on the Turkmen case, and I should mention that there was a big group of experts. And Samoilovich, and it is actually an answer probably to the next question, he had a very particular relation with Muhammad Gildiev, the first Turkmen philologist and the first Turkmen linguist, because they have the common understanding of the folklore monuments, the way how they should be collected, the way how they should be classified, systemized, and so on. And for example, they collected proverbs, and Samoilovich found out his book about proverbs as one of the most important within the Turkmen intellectual space. And later on, it was a reason for the huge friendship and communication. And we have a letter from Gildiev where he asked Samoilovich to be an editor of his textbook, Turkmen language. So in comparison with some other scholars, I would like to mention, I love this example actually, about two anthropologists who were working in Turkmenistan at this particular period in the 1920s and the 1930s. One of them was Nadezhda Vladimirovna Brylova-Shaskolskaya. It's rather hard to understand, well, non-Russian speaker. She was a granddaughter of the prominent architect Alexander Brylov, was connected with relations with the very well-known Russian artist and painter Karl Brylov. She was the graduate of Heidelberg, and she was working in Rome. And later on, she came back to Russia and became a political activist. She was fighting for the Jewish rights and the human rights during the revolutionary period. And she was sent to exile to Central Asia. And there she began her anthropologist career. She began to collect the information about Turkmen women. And later on, she collected numerous verses and became one of the well-known translator of the Turkmen poetry. And the second example was the local ethnographer. His name is Grigory Karpov. He was an NKVD officer who found out that it's possible to use ethnography for the regulation of the ethnic relation and administrative way of thinking. And his works were primarily dedicated to the history of ethnic groups in Turkmenistan, and later on he made a transition to the collecting of folklore and of literature monuments. So they had a severe rivalry between them, because Brylova-Shaskolskaya considered his research without being an awful thing without methodology. She considered that every single piece of folklore that is collected should be regulated by the specific methodology to be objectified as an academic knowledge. Well, Karpov, in his turn, considered that she wasn't able to see all the details on the ground. That there is, and this is exactly about this kind of ruptures between the academicians and the practitioners during the early Soviet period. And if we will take a whole look at the community, we'll find out that numerous representatives of something, well, we call these persons these days scholars, but actually they were only collectioners. And Samoilovich was a representative of the academician of the academia. He was closely related with an understanding of methodology and the necessity of using the methodology. And that's the difference between him and his community and other community of experts who tried to collect the materials on Central Asia. And if we're talking about the inside of the academic community and inside the academia, we'll find out that Belovo-Shaskolska was a severe critique of Bartlett and his students in Leningrad, because she considered that they simply collected material and they simply described them. They didn't do any kind of analytical work. And once again, it is a very important thing about their attitude and their approach that was used by different group of scholars at this period in Central Asia. And she considered herself an important figure for the transmit of methodological knowledge. And was a reason why she asked her Leningrad colleagues to send her works published in, for example, Germany and the United States, like the Bosch's publication about the Indians. She wanted to get them and to to organize the education and learning of these books inside the Central Asia. So there is such a great amount of personalities in this period. She's one of the brightest examples.
And dear Anton, do you think you have answered all of Xavier's comments?
No, not yet.
I'm just also thinking about the Q&A session. So would you accept to give maybe shorter answers to the next points?
Okay, well, we'll go to the questions, and after that, I will return to Xavier's, questions.
No, I mean, if there are 2 or 3 points that you really want to answer now, please do so. I don't want to interrupt, I mean, the flow, but just thinking about the next step.
It's fine. Well, about the communication with the party officials and trust within the party and the party officials. Well, it is a rather hard question, and it is about it. Well, the political affiliation is actually in Central Asia is a rather doubtful thing, especially in this period, because there was a very narrow group of the guys who were capable of working in the academic sphere. And they've tried to use all the possible resources to, to create and to establish Soviet authority in the region. And for example, it was a reason why in Turkmenistan, for instance, the head of the Sovnarkom, Gaigus was the representative of the SR party. And Belovo-Shaskolska, who was sent in exile, was also a member of SR party. It means Socialist Revolutionary Party. And they had their own personal relation, and it was very important for the academic projects at this period in the 1920s. But after that, in the 1930s, the situation has changed completely. And the affiliation with the Bolshevik Party became a very important thing. So Samoilovich was actually, he was not a member of the party, and it should be mentioned separately. He even was not a part of the Marxist Orientalist community. So he had trust, and if we will take a look at his communication before the revolution, almost all of them, all the members of the list were immigrated. It means that they were representative of the nationalist movements of the different parties that were in opposition to Bolsheviks. And after the revolution, they migrated to Europe, and the most prominent example is Mustafa Chukayev from Kazakhstan, right? And well, after the revolution, Samoilovich was working with the different personalities he was, in trustful relation with, and Yumutsky was one of them. And Yumutsky knew quite well indeed the intellectuality of the Turkmenistan of the initial period, because numerous representatives passed through military schools, and he was in charge of this, of sending Turkmens, young Turkmens, to the military school. So he was able to manage this kind of relations and the establishment of the new relations for Samoilovich in some sense. So the difference between discourse in letters and articles. It is very interesting because letters are rather personal. And I mean, there are numerous personal details. And we'll speak about, you know, the direct quoting. In some early works, Samoilovich directly used, you know, the literate quotes from the letters of Hoja al-Mullah. Even introduced, there was even text in Arabic script, and later in the translation. But later, the situation was changed, and there were some references, and in some cases, and I consider it as the main thing for Samoilovich's activity as Orientalist, he tried to appropriate the voices of his informants. And it's a very interesting example. In the 1903 and 1913, Samoilovich was participating in a number of discussion of the studies of the Turkmen language in the former Russian Empire, and he used the pseudonym of a Turkmen guy. He presented himself as a representative of the Turkmen people to present the position of the Turkmens. It is a very interesting example because he hid his own identity. He tried to reinforce his own words by representing some kind of Turkmen point of view. And we see that kind of a difference because in the letters, he tried to understand the position, and in the articles, he represented kind of false position, that I am the representative. While in letters, he was only a student or listener. And a final question was about the personal interest and career path. Well, if we'll speak about all that kind of groups, we'll find out that numerous representatives of Samoilovich's network of informants were later hired by the Leningrad Oriental Institute, where he formulated a specific structure Turkological seminary, where they were working on the culture of the Central Asia. And later on, numerous representatives were also working in the Central Asian academic establishment and institutions. And when Samoilovich was ahead of the Kazakh expedition of the Academy of Sciences, numerous Turkmens as well were hired by the Kazakh branch of the Academy of Sciences under Samoilovich's guidance. So in some cases, it actually had an impact on their careers and on their positions. And I would like to mention also a very interesting example tied to connected to Khwarezm, because Samoilovich was during a period in the 1920s, probably a period of 2 or 3 years, he was a leading expert of the People's Commissariat on International Affairs, and he was in charge of working with the ethnic conflict in Khwarezm. And during the negotiations between Checherian, the head of the commissariat, with the representative of Khwarezm political elite, Samoilovich used his knowledge of the local voices that was presented to him early by those Khwarezmians to present their position about the relations with Russian Socialist Federalist Republic. And it made an impact on the formulation of the further agreements. And these episodes were mentioned in Babakun Salimov's. It was the Nazir of Law, Minister of Law in Khwarezm, and they were mentioned in his diary. So now I will go to questions. Okay, what's Turkmen language? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
What's the Turkmen language?
I just wanted to introduce some of the questions because Ambassador de la Housse, who's a high career diplomat but also a trained historian, asked some questions. So yes, if you want, Anton, you can read them. It's the first 2 questions about the Turkmen language and the Orientalist milieu.
Was Turkmen language also used as an instrument of communication between these Orientalists, or only Russian, Turkish, and Arabic languages? Well, it is a very interesting question because inside the Orientalist community, for example, Leningrad, they use numerous references to Arabic terms and different Turkish phenomenon. For example, they called themselves a Sufi order, and they referred to a different, high authorities in the Orientalist circle as a sheikh and so on. About the use of the Turkmen language, it was used in communication between the Russian Orientalists and the local scholars. For example, the letter by Muhammad Gildiyev was written in the Turkmen, but between themselves, they were mostly relied on some kind of Arabic verses because they had this passionate and very interesting and exotifying viewing of Islam. And they were discussing it a lot. And there is also a very interesting example in the letter written to Samoilovich by his mother. He tried to write his name Shura, short name Alexander, in Arabic script. And later on, she mentioned, "Oh, it should be a consul in Turkish language." So it is a very interesting example how that kind of transition and that kind of appropriation was moving in the circle, not only of Orientalists themselves, but their relatives. And I would like also to mention that the Turkmen language and the Turkmen culture was also interested not only to Samoilovich, but his environment. And it's worth to know that after that, in the 1940s, Krachkovsky, his close friend and prominent Russian Arabist, one of he's famous due to his translation of Quranic Karim, was interested in the Turkmen literature and the relations between Turkmen literature and Arabic language. He established a communication with one of the Turkmen literature critique, Zeliha Bakivna Muhamedova, and they were working on the analysis of the Turkmen verses and sometimes on the Turkish elements in the Arabic verses. It is about that kind of situation in the Orientalist community. Did the Stalin's purges also strike the Orientalist milieu in the 1930s? Of course it was. It was a case. So Orientalist milieu was probably one of the biggest community affected by the Stalin's purges because they had the communication with foreign countries. They had the inner communication with the nationalist groups. And for example, Samoilovich was killed in 1938, and he was, and there were accusations that he created a group of the Turkmen Basmachi inside the Soviet academic institution. And it was one of the points for him to be, for his lawsuit. And the question also, thank you for your presentation. What is the heritage of those scholars' work from the Fauve period in today's Central Asia? It is actually a very interesting question and a very important question, because if we'll take a look at their work, we'll find out that most constructs that they've tried to establish in the 1920s and 1930s are preserved nowadays. And I used, for example, when I was studying the Samoilovich's legacy, there is a case of the textbook Rovnak al-Islam. Rovnak al-Islam was a textbook used in the Turkmen schools for the Turkmen pupils, for the nomadic population to learn Islamic basics of Islamic religion and ethics, and at the same time to use how to make, how to work in the nomadic environment. So Samoilovich made a huge work on this textbook, and he identified its author as someone called Vipai. In this year, in 2020, there was a publication by American specialist on Islam and on educational system on Islam, Alan Frank, who believed that the name Vipai is also misreading of the text by Samoilovich. So he made a mistake by identifying an epithet to an author, and he considered it as an author of the book. And Vipai was by Samoilovich's student, Abdulhakim Kul Muhamedov. The name of Vipai was introduced to the Turkmen row of the poets, and he even created his biography. he mentioned that it should be a person educated in the madrasa in the 16th century and so on. And currently, if you will read news about Turkmenistan, if you will read Turkmen news, for example, President of Turkmenistan made a visit to Libab Vilayat, to the region of Libab, and he was present in the local library. They presented him the oldest book written in the Turkmen language, the Untitled Chapter, written by someone called Vipai. So the construct is still alive, even despite the purges, even despite all that kind of political and later academician work. They preserved and they still be vital, and they be still essential, for example, for the Turkmen identity. And we have numerous examples of that. And the same thing is we can say about the Uzbek things, because, for example, in the 1925 there was a very interesting case when three countries, three republics, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, made a discourse whose poet is Alisher Navai, and Samoilovich take a part in this discussion, and it was a beginning of the end of his relation with some of the groups inside these countries, because he had quite a distinguishable position from them about this phenomenon. So that kind of things, and we know quite well indeed that the cult of Alisher Navai is preserved in modern day Uzbekistan, was introduced in these particular years by, for example, Abdurrahman Fitrat, was really a man who constructed that kind of cult in the modern day Uzbek, and it preserved in the modern day Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Anton. I would like also to underline that after the first questions by Ambassador Dulahous, who served in Turkmenistan for several years, the latest question was about our colleague Romain Gouvernet, who's actually a director of the French Institute in Ashgabat. I would like to invite the public to ask questions. So there is a special box down here on your screen where you see the number 4 highlighted by a red bubble. So, and in the chat, you can ask your questions. And if you wish, we even have the technical possibility to put you on camera if you want. While people maybe think and write their questions in the chat box. Yes, I see one. Congrats for the presentation from Maria Francesca Meloni. I'd like to know more about which was the perception of the ancient history of the region that Samoilovich and his entourage had. So how did Samoilovich perceive ancient history and people around him? A question from Maria Francesca Meloni. Thank you.
That is a very crucial question, and it is a very important thing, because it was basic for the severe discussion between Orientalists and local intellectuals. Well, there is a specific work written by Matthias Battis, who's a German specialist, and he was working with the legacy of Alexander Simonov, who was permanently living in Central Asia, who was a very close friend of Samoilovich. And Simonov and Bartlett had their own position that Central Asia should be included in the Russian history as the region of one of the most ancient Aryan civilization that was, you know, the preceders of the Russians and all the European nations. So they were considered Central Asia as some kind of oikumena. And Samoilovich was also part of this group. While the local intellectuals, they insisted on Turkic and modern day, which is the most important, the historical figures that is related to the regions, and they will fight with each other about that kind of issue. The second thing is about that Samoilovich believes in the heterogeneity of the local culture. And it's very interesting to read his works on the Turkmen literature. He had tried to create that kind of viewing that inside of this literature, there is multiple elements taken borrowings from different regions and different times. And he constructed that kind of a timeline with the separate periods, centralized periods. While for the Turkmens themselves, their history started from the 18th century. And it's very interesting thing that in Turkmenistan before the 1930s, there were no works on the history itself. There were predominantly works on the history of literature or on the genealogy. So Samoilovich also tried to implement that idea of heterogeneity, and some of the local intellectuals supported his ideas, while others consider it as inappropriate for them because they were not important for this particular period and for the further Soviet construction of the state. And if we'll take a look, for example, in the 1927, Samoilovich's student, Abdulhakim Kulmuhamedov, published a tale, Sayat al-Himra, which is actually a folk-side tale. It was widespread among the population of Azerbaijan and Turkey, not in Turkmenistan, but he tried to show it as an ancient monument of the Turkmen literature. And in the 1930s, they consider, after the purges and after the death of Kulmuhamedov, they consider this move as inappropriate, as a spending of the budget of the Republic for unworthy publication. However, that particular dastan, this particular tale, entered the history, into the Turkmen literature, and nowadays you can see, for example, in the Turkmen theaters, you know, Sayat al-Himra is presented as a dramatic thing. So we have such great amount of approaches and attitudes connected with the ancient history and viewing by the Orientalist community from one side and local Muslim community from another side. And it is very important that it was a reason for the rivalry between them.
Okay, thank you for these answers. And I really would like to encourage people to ask questions. I have some ideas, some things that I would like to ask Anton, but I don't want to abuse from my dominating position. So please feel free to ask your questions in written form, in the chat box, or the special Q&A option down on your screen, and I will read them, and we can even put you on camera. While people are thinking about these questions, then I guess I will ask mine. Anton, do you think today in Turkmenistan there is an interest among scholars in Turkmenistan today about this specific period of time, about the issues that you have presented today, about these people, about the process of knowledge production at that time? What is the interest today among our colleagues in Turkmenistan about this?
Yes, of course there is an interest. Well, initially it should be started that there are two very big figures in the modern day academia, one in Turkmenistan and one is going to Turkey. And they are publishing numerous texts because they consider that this text, in this text they can find pure and true, the pure truth about the Turkmen culture. So they wanted to republish them, and they are working very hard on it. The second thing, they wanted the youth in Turkmenistan to know about their past. So one more time, it is the works written by Sayegov, Murad Gildi, and the Hirashurov, and the daughter of Sayegov, Aina Sayegova. And they participated in a number of conferences. And I know that even the IFEAC published one of the articles written by Sayegov probably 2 or 3 years ago in Paris. So the work is on. And currently there is such a very interesting thing that they've tried to address their cultural legacy to implement the new views, for example, the ecological standpoint. And I saw recently an article about the mythology of rivers and mythology of a river goddess, where one of the crucial elements of this article written by the Turkmen scholar was an unpublished manuscript by Samoilovich that is preserved in their archive. We had a conversation with a mail, and he asked me for the support of searching here in St. Petersburg other documents, because numerous things left in the archives without publication. And there is interest, and they consider currently Samoilovich as one of the founders of the manuscript studies in Turkmenistan, and you can see his portrait in the national. It was formerly the National Institute of Manuscripts. Yeah. There is a portrait of Samoilovich here. There. So. Okay, thanks. Very interesting. Any other question from our beloved public? Because I see there are still 7 people connected, and 3 of them asked questions. So I'm sure there is plenty of aspects which remain under question and can be investigated further. At least what I can say from my standpoint is that we should discuss in the future possible publications maybe, or bigger event associating colleagues who also work on similar issues and the same period of time. At least that's what I would suggest for now. And are you sure in the public that you don't want to ask any more questions?
So maybe I will have some, sorry, Adrien, maybe I will have some more questions and some comments about, well, about, say, in attending other questions. Maybe I have 2 or 3 elements first. First one where you were talking about trust, and what I was trying to say in my comments, first comments. It's more not the question of be part of the party or had kind of Marxist ideology. It was more the kind of attitude from kind of Russian or Russian-speaking member of the party to non-Russians, and a kind of colonial attitude were really strong in the 20s. And even if we are talking about revolutionary from Kazakhstan, from Tatarstan, from Central Asia, we were really intending to implement the revolution. They were not trust, and this question of trust is very important. And where you were mentioning Validov or Validit Togan, the Bashkir, and we have the same question when during the civil war in 1919, he was trying to negotiate with the Bolshevik to create the Bashkir autonomy, and he was trying to trust the Bolshevik, even if that was different, maybe orientation or vision about what will be the national autonomy. But he tried to trust them, and in exchange, he wanted them to trust him, that he was creating a national autonomy, but inside the Soviet system. And this kind of trust never went, and it's, I think, one of the reasons why he left. And when you mention Mustafa Shokai, I think he's at the beginning knew that there were no trust possible between Bolshevik and him, and so he didn't even try to make some kind of collaboration or trying to negotiate with the Bolshevik, and he left. And this question of trust is quite important inside this relation, which was before the revolution of 1917 or after. And in a sense, when you were talking about correspondence, about this question of trust, it's very important, I think, for the people to construct themselves and their thoughts, their political vision, also their scientific vision about the region, and how they can trust what was saying the person, and how they can take it to by themselves, trying to imagine to create their own models about any kind of scholars element or political elements. So that's what's one of the precision I wanted to make. The other one was your example about the different anthropologists. You were mentioning about Karpov from the NKVD, or this granddaughter of this architect who are working out Turkmen. What was very interesting, it's in what we say Samoilovich, or these two persons, the subject they were surveying were really related to their own interests. So when we see Karpov, he was looking at ethnic tribes because he thought that here was the key elements for political stability and for political strategies of different persons. So we were looking at ethnic elements. And with still today, there were a lot of people who are interested in nowadays political. They are really interested in this kind of histories about ethnics, about tribes and tribalism. And there is a lot of question, why do we make some accents on these elements, and which are not always relevant. And when we say this this woman, I don't remember her name, she first were working on Turkmen women. So I think, of course, it's maybe because she can had access to this woman, as a man or an anthropologist who couldn't have access to this kind of informants. But also, I think it's her way, her interest, who make her have some work on the Turkmen woman. And when we see Samoilovich, he's an Orientalist. So he's in this school of Orientalism and trying to build, as Validov made some critics about him, some generalization, some big models about Orientalism, about Turkmen, about Central Asian, Turkish world. And so he, as you said, it was really interested in kind of preservation of some folklore, but that was not his main interest. And he, especially when we see about other persons who are collecting folklore at that period, who were really interested in the way they could build the nation through the folklore, through the building of history, to make a long history of the people, and to be able to create this national conscience. And in the way you were talking about Samoilovich, we didn't see this element of national constructions, political ideas. Is more on a scholar way. And in also because, as we all know, scholar ways and political are not separate, and there always are some influence from both sides. Here I have one of my questions. One of the first publication of Samoilovich is about the way Turkmens are, the Turkmen warfare, if you can say, the warrior, and the way they are, I think it's about Bitva Tekentov, one of these publications. And as we know, the Battle of Göktepe was very important in the Russian society, and about the representation of Turkmens. And the question is, if Samoilovich was like prolonging this representation of Turkmen warrior, or if he also take his part in the constructions of this model, which is still nowadays one of the main representation of Turkmens. If we compare to Uzbek or Kazakh, who were also some kind of rebellion, but in the imaginary of the Russian scholarship, and after the Russian and Soviet representation of people, if we say Kazakh or Uzbek, they are not representing as warriors or have a specific warfare. Thank you.
Great. I see no more questions, so I'm a bit puzzled because I would like to say that hearing someone presenting research on Turkmens, it's really not so frequent. So from my viewpoint, scientifically speaking, it's really precious and very original. So I really encourage the public to ask questions. I think some of the people here in the public are also based there in Ashgabat. So maybe for technical reasons, it's not so easy to ask questions, but we had one already at the beginning. And I'm also very happy that Anton and Xavier, you had this exchange of views on the basis of the period on which you specialize, which is quite close. And I think it opens a pathway for comparisons, more systematically speaking. Maybe I myself have probably a final questions, which would be about your sources and the kind of archives that you use. Because I saw in your slideshow, the PowerPoint presentation, that you also relied on personal archives from some of these people, specialists. So how do you articulate access to maybe official, governmental, local archives managed by authorities and personal archives?
Okay, let's first of all speak about Russians and non-Russians relations. That is a very important thing because in the 1913 there was a lawsuit against Turkmens, the group of Turkmens. Actually, it was a lawsuit against Yumursky, and it was considered, and there was a huge, discussion of the way how to treat Turkmens. And there is a very interesting quote: "Do you want to make the second Finland from the Turkmenistan?" Because Finland was considered a complete disaster for the Russian Empire. Well, in that sense, German scholars consider that as a very interesting example of the racism inside the Russian army, because the Russian, even in the empire period, because the Russian Empire, there were a group of Muslims inside the Russian military forces, and other groups, for example, Russian militaries, they had this kind of very controversial approach to them. And well, if we will talk about the Soviet period of time, of course, there was heated discussions about the Europeans and natives. And we know for sure that when Samoilovich became a person, well, a rather doubtful person, when he go against Komisarly Buriyev, who was at this moment a head of Commissariat for Education, and he was in charge of the entire academic work in Turkmenistan at this moment in the early 1920s. He was considered to be a European who had no right to deal with the Turkmen culture, and his works were called meaningless in some of the publications. But later in 1913, Samoilovich was reintroduced as a prominent scholar to the Turkmen during the Turkmen-Soviet conferences. So it's not only a question about trust, but it was also a question about tactic and strategy, and strategy of cultural construction, and strategy of the control of the institutions inside the Republic and in Moscow, for example. So it is a very interesting thing because they use that kind of thing, the difference between Europeans and natives, especially during the period of cultural construction, as the possibility to, to limit and to create the borders where their, field of work is. Well, about tribes I think it is connected very closely with an attempt to understand the way how the Turkmen social order is functioning, and the whole Central Asia, how it's functioning, and how you can control the way how it's functioning, how you can provide a kind of an administrative division, for example, and the regulation, the law regulation. So Samoilovich, in my view, he was working primarily on the cultural legacy, not working on social. He had some works dedicated to ethnography, but they were mostly dedicated to some kind of local traditions, to the local games, to the position of women in the Turkmen tribes. But there were not such great works that were produced, for example, by Karpov about the tribal orders and the way how the tribal classification should be done. So I think, and folklore, it is interesting because Samoilovich was a comparativist. So for him, the Turkmen culture was seen as a part of the larger Turkic-speaking folklore groups. So I don't think that it was such a question, a viable question. However, in the 1920s, in the late 1920s, in the middle of the 1920s, Samoilovich was a part of the KIPS, the Commission for Tribal Communities of the USSR, and you know that the tribal division of the USSR, and I know quite well indeed that he was in charge of the Central Asian analytics. So he had to deal with the tribes, and he mentioned them in his Soviet works. But was it seen as a possible source for state building? From my perspective, that I was seeing among the Turkmens, there was a movement called Birleşik. So they wanted to unify all the Turkmen groups, but not based on the tribal identity, but mostly on the territorial identity. Because Turkmens were living in Bukhara, Turkmens were living in Khiva, and Turkmens were living in Stavropol, Iran, and Astrakhan. And the initial idea, is I was able to capture it, was to unify the territorial groups of Turkmens within one republic. And that was the driving thing, the driving element of the Turkmenistan construction as a state, of the Soviet state. So about the military structure and about his work on Zhendnama, well, Zhendnama mostly was seen for him as some kind of his last work on with Turkmen. So he was made this kind of introduction. He was briefly discussed the political events. There was no, that kind of conception of what the Turkmen tribe is and how it's functioning. He mentioned it only briefly. Main purpose, as it was in his early works, was to find out what the relation is between different Islamic groups. Islam is very crucial for that first period because he considered Islam as the most important thing of the local identity. He compared the Shia Islam, because it is actually a poem about the fight between Iranians and Turkmens. He was compared that kind of different Islamic branches. What else I can say about it? Well, and I do remember that in this book, in this particular book, he mentioned his approach, his methodological approach to speak with the Turkmen directly. And it was a reason for fight against another Orientalist, if you want so. But I don't remember any kind of reference to the military order and so on. And finally, I would like to speak about the archives, right? Well, we have a number of archives here in the state archives and the archives at the universities and in the academic institutions. They are rather open. The two key problems are the price of copying and, some of the documents are restricted to access. For example, in the Nkevada report, it is mentioned that Samoilovich is blamed to the problems with the budget of the Institute of Orientalism. He was a director of the Institute of Orientalism. but the entire accounted documents are restricted and denied to be presented to the reader. So it is rather hard to understand what was the reason for that kind of accusation. Well, after that, I will mention the private archives, right? And I was truly grateful to Marin Platon that she granted me an access to her family archive. It was in 2016 or 2017 when the special plate dedicated to Samoilovich as a victim of Stalin's purges was installed on his former house here in St. Petersburg. And it was her intention to make it because the academic institutions were able, due to the budgetary shortages, to make this, to install any kind of monument, and she wanted to do that. And she installed this plate dedicated to him as a victim of purges. And I was able to find her there and to communicate with her, and so she provided full access to his documents. And also, I was able to work with the family archive of one of his students in Moscow. It is Adrien, a prominent Turkmen writer, and his granddaughter was truly excited that someone is working on his legacy, and she presented her whole archive. But in some cases, yes, there is huge and severe restrictions. And it happened to me to working with the granddaughter of Brylova-Shaskolskaya, who, for example, made her own choice of the documents that I was able to copy. It is quite a distinguishable example. So she provided kind of limitation for me to understand only a good knowledge about her grandmother, and to get not to get the whole access to the family archive.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, I'm very convinced that this format, even on digital format, of having a presentation by someone who's extensively working on a topic and comments, discussion by a specialist is a very fruitful, actually, model. And there are many, discussions and controversies in the academia about the most relevant format, the most suitable, the most satisfying format of discussion, which would be not violent for anyone, pleasing, but still interesting. And still, I think having one presentation and one discussion and then a Q&A session is still, but I think it's important to have this, deep conversation. It's because Xavier was able to read part of your material, and he's also a specialist in this period of time, that we can have this discussion. And the public now, I think, is leaving progressively, because I think it's already 5:45 here in Bishkek. But still, hopefully we have these technical instruments. And really, I would like to thank both of you. First, Anton, for agreeing to participate to this first winter webinar here at IFEAC in Bishkek, which I think launches a new wave of scientific activities, unfortunately online, even if I would dream to have us all physically gathered in a point. Could be Bishkek, could be somewhere else. Also, thanks to Xavier, who agreed to participate. And we all wait for him here in Bishkek. He's going to be, he's already a senior researcher affiliated to IFEAC for several years. And so having a historian here on site will be a major asset. And I see some of our colleagues here are connected. So if I would like to benefit from this these last minutes and having selected members of the public here. If you are a scholar, especially a historian, and you would like to continue discussing these issues or present your own material, IFEAC, as the French Institute of Central Asian Studies here, in Bishkek, but operating in all the region, is very open to suggestions. So please feel free. We are here to support research, all generations, all disciplines from the humanities in the broader sense. So we are really ready to support your ideas. Thank you again, Anton and Xavier, and hopefully see you soon. And to the public also, thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess we'll resume here.
Thank you very much, Adrien, for the possibilities like about my research, and thank you, Xavier, for very notable and very interesting references and your questions and commentaries.
Cool.
Thank you very much, Adrien and Anton. Your presentation was very interesting, and there is a lot of things to discuss still. So I think we will have more conversation and more discussion in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the weekend. I mean, it's Saturday, so have a good rest, everyone.